Hello, everybody. My name is Roy Cohen, and I'll be hosting this week's Community Forum show. And, if you ever tell a story, you know that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Today's guest is a veteran. He's a lifelong resident of Stoughton and was involved physically with the Vietnam War. His name is Mark Hausammann, pretty active community leader. And welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Roy. Look forward to talking with you.
Okay, why don't we start off with a little bit of background about you, if you don't mind.
Okay. So if we start currently right now, I'm still living in Stoughton. I left the town only for a very short period of time when I was in the service. And then I had a little issue in the town after I got out where the people were very upset with Vietnam veterans. So in order to protect myself, I moved into Boston to get away from the Stoughton citizens and lived in there for a few years. And then when I married, I came back out because by then people weren't so upset with the Vietnam veterans.
That's interesting. I seem to remember the reception that Vietnam veterans received from the citizens in the United States. What do you think was the reason for that?
Well, I think they attributed the poor performance of the war with the actual soldiers. So, for example, when I got out of the service and I landed in Washington State, when I got off the plane, less than a day before I was in combat, I got off the plane, and at the end of the stairway that we walked down was an MP with a dog. And I asked the guy, "What's the dog for?" And he says, "It's to sniff you for drugs." And I said, "If that dog comes near me, I'll kill it." So he moved the dog back. And then when I got my, they dressed me in a uniform and all that, but you couldn't travel in the United States wearing a military uniform. So they took us by bus and gave us $100 so we could buy civilian clothes to travel across from Washington back to Massachusetts. And all over the country, every airport you went to, they were abusing soldiers. And when I finally got home, I just stayed in my house. And then the following year, I guess it would have been 1970, my father was a World War II veteran. And the VFW asked him if he and I could march in the parade carrying the flags. So I said, yeah. I didn't realize that my town would be still so upset, but we walked in the parade. And as I was walking along, I guess where Mead's Pond is, some of the people will know that just before the town spa, which wasn't there at the time, a woman came out with an American flag with a spear point on it and tried to stab me with it and spit on my uniform. And the people watching the parade just let it happen. And when we got up to I think it's the cemetery up there, I can't remember the name of it now, my father just looked at me and said, "What happened here? How could this be?" And he was just embarrassed for me. We hugged and we never talked about it again. And I just went about my life, went back into the city and stayed away until Stoughton residents, I guess, kind of came around.
And that was what you said you were in Boston for a year?
A couple of years. I went in there and I met my wife we worked at Todd Herron. I know some of you people might remember the Herron name, but he got me a job in a bank. And my wife worked there also. So we courted while she was going to college. She was just finishing high school when I met her. And so we courted. And at the time, I was very sick from the war. I had malaria, two different kinds of it. I had a blood disease, so I was I had a bluish tinge to my skin. I had lost 8 teeth in 1 year over there, and my teeth were a mess. And the veterans in the Army just wouldn't take care of us at the time. They didn't like us either for some reason. So Maryland got me my wife to be got me in touch with her dentist, and he got me in contact with the Boston University School of Graduate Dentistry, and they worked on me for 2 years to fix what was wrong. And in the process, they had to give me antibiotics because my teeth were so infected. The antibiotics cleared up my intestinal tract because I was 6 feet tall. I only weighed 128 pounds when I got
Wow,
out.
that's thin.
So I was really like a little snake kind of guy. But once they got the infections under control, I started to gain weight, and then eventually they got my teeth fixed up. But all that was done as a civilian, nothing from the military or the Veterans Administration. They just avoided us for some reason. I don't know why.
Well, you certainly don't show any signs of it if someone were to see you. Um, I remember having lunch with you on a fairly regular basis in Quincy, and you look sharp.
Yeah, well, I gained weight, and I can't give most of the credit to Howie Turbin Health and Fitness. He took me from that little skinny guy that I came, and he told me it would take him 2 years if I followed his regimen to build up my chest muscles and my arm muscles. And so I did what he said, and eventually, I grew bigger. I started to put on muscle mass, and still worked. I worked out with him for 40 years, and I worked in banking, so I wasn't doing like physical stuff. I was doing mostly, desk work type of things.
Yeah. You said in your notes that Stoughton was in a process of change. It was in a transition from factory town to whatever it is at this point today.
A suburban community, basically.
Were you drafted, or did you volunteer?
I volunteered only because I would have been drafted. Like every Friday, I go out to lunch with my high school buddies, and all of us went into the service. I graduated in 1966, and there was no option. We were a blue collar town. None of these guys could afford, neither could I at the time, to go to college. So one of them went into the Air Force, another guy went into the Seabees. So we all, either joined. I don't know that any of us were drafted, but I joined, and I wanted to make sure that they didn't send me to something I didn't want. But I did join the Army and trained with them.
Were you able to pick and choose your location to be sent to?
Not really. I tried. This is probably a cute little story. But when I went in, they thought I was a mathematical genius because I could add two numbers together. So they assigned me to be an 11H, which was a designation, and it was an anti-tank person. And so what I could do is I could fire big weapons, and I could also work with explosives, and I could add up the numbers and come out with the result. And so I thought for sure that I was going to go to Germany because they didn't have tanks in Vietnam. But when they had two lines when we finished our training, one was for Vietnam and the other was for Europe. And so they had put me in the line to go to Vietnam. So I told the master sergeant, I think you got me in the wrong line. My training is in anti-tanks. He said, so it's 11H. And he says, okay, we can fix that. And he crossed out the H and put in a B. And that was 11 Bravo, which means an infantry soldier. So rather than put me in the line to go to Europe, I ended up staying in the line to go to Vietnam.
Prior to that, if I recall, the draft was in effect.
Yes.
And somehow they assigned specific numbers to all candidates for the draft. And if your number was called, that's when you went in. Otherwise, you were forgotten, so to speak.
Right, until your number came up.
I remember personally that when I was being inspected for the draft, made it all the way through until the doctor at the end says, "Is there anything we might have missed?" And I pointed to my feet, and he says, "Wow, you got flat feet." So they gave me a designation of 1Y,
Huh.
which was it stood for in case of an all-out disaster, a national disaster, or war. Then they're not going to bother me. And then when the Vietnamese War got worse, they came after me again. And at that particular time, I was married, and that kept you out.
Right.
And one more time after that, they came after me. My wife was pregnant with our firstborn, David, and that kept me out. And they haven't come back after me since then.
Well, you're very lucky. Very, very lucky.
Yeah, I just feel that I was lucky.
Mhm.
Uh, but you lived on School Street. Is the house still there?
Yes, it is. And if people are familiar with the area, it's down just past where school intersects with Elm Street, and you go up the hill, and it basically that area was the Stoughton's Poor Farm. So before, Social Security and things like that, Stoughton took care of the residents by uh, putting them on a farm. And there was a farmhouse next to where my father built his home that was the poor farm. And there was a little thing across the street on the curve that was the barn where they kept all that stuff. So all of that area, once they got out of the poor farm business, the town wanted veterans to build up the town. So they offered them veterans lots, house lots for $10. And my father got one, and all of the houses down on School Street, just past Elm Street, Gibson's, I think, was there, but all the rest of them were veterans lots. And the veterans, the GIs coming home, bought them for $10, and then the guys built their homes, housing. They helped each other and got it all built. And that's where I was raised. So I had six brothers and sisters, and we lived in a little ranch. Raised wasn't a raised ranch at the time; it was just a regular ranch. And I had four sisters and two brothers, myself. So we were all raised there. And my father worked in factories, and my mother didn't work, of course, because back then most of the women were housewives, I guess they call them. I don't know what the right word is today. That's not offensive, but they maintained the home and raised the children.
Midwives,
Yeah.
whatever they were. I read through your notes, and I thank you for submitting them. They're quite extensive. But the section of that I found missing was your stories about Vietnam itself. I remember reading something that you posted online about tunnels.
Yes.
If you want to get into a little bit of detail of what you went through once you got to Vietnam, your job and things you saw and how it might have affected you and stuff like that.
Okay, so what happened is after I finished my training and I was trained as a paratrooper, and I joined a special brigade that was going to Vietnam. And because we were all going together, we went by ship. So I sailed across the Pacific with 5,000 men on a boat, an old Liberty ship, just like you think in World War II. And it took us 21 days to cross the Pacific Ocean. And we got to a place called Quinh Nhon, which was in Vietnam. And there we offloaded onto trucks that were going to take us 100 miles inland up into the mountains, Central Highlands, they call them. And what was interesting about that little trip was they gave all these big GIs 3 days of rations. So that's, think, 9 meals. And the big sergeant that passed them out to us said, when we get to Ankh, which was where we were going up in the Central Highlands, you have to have all of these rations with you. And we didn't understand what he was talking about. But as we rode along in the convoy, all these trucks with all these guys on it, the Vietnamese people were by the side of the road, whole families, extended families, grandparents, all that. And these people were literally starving to death. So all of the guys, this whole convoy of whatever, say 5,000 men, probably a few less, threw out all the rations to the people. And when we got to Ankh, nobody had a ration because we had thrown them all out to feed the people. And I grew up poor. I mean, I was in Stoughton, and there were, with my family, we didn't have any money. My father worked 3 jobs, all that sort of stuff. And but I never saw poverty like I saw when I went into that war zone.
Sure.
And then from there, we traveled around by helicopter, which was the first time the American forces used helicopters in war. And we would go to areas, and it would, in the first part, it was called free fire zones and strategic hamlets. So we were trying to get the Vietnamese people in the countryside to move into locations where we could protect them. And then we would go out in any of the remaining villages, and we could shoot anything that was there, animals, people, anything, because they were assumed to be the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese. But in that role, we would come into some of these villages, and there'd be a tunnel system. So because the Americans would, use artillery and bombing runs, what the Vietnamese people did was they dug tunnels under their villages so they could move around and not get, destroyed by, the bombs and that sort of stuff. So I wasn't afraid of, like snakes and bugs and all that. So I could go into those tunnels, and plus I was very skinny, obviously. So these tunnels weren't like you would see in the movies. They weren't like caves. They were basically crawl holes. So I could crawl in there and, go after the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese people that were in there. So I did that. And I think the first time that I had an encounter in there, I carried a 45 pistol because I couldn't carry the rifle crawling in there. And I could sense the guy was there, a Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldier. So I put the pistol up and I fired it. And that was probably the worst thing I ever did when I was over there, because the compressed area that I was in caused me to lose my hearing and my sight because I was blinded by the flash and the round going off in the hole. So when I got out, they thought I had been hit or wounded because I was covered with my own stuff plus the man that I had engaged in. So they, took off my shirt, and the medic finally cleaned me up and got me back online so that I could work again. So it was sort of like that. I mean, I never, as I advanced in, rank, I never asked anybody of my squads to go into those tunnels. I always did that myself because I could do it. I knew what was down there. I knew how to operate in those, confined spaces. So I did that. And
Did the tunnels have they have electricity?
no,
No
there was
lights,
no electricity at all.
no ventilation.
No ventilation. These were just holes in the ground. Think about digging a trench, and you couldn't stand in them. You could just crawl through them. And what they would do is they would move their soldiers around to where the machine gun was or where they needed ammunition. They would people would carry that stuff to the machine gun places, and that's what I interrupted when I would go in there. I would go to stop them from, fortifying a machine gun position. And after that, I traveled all over Vietnam, mostly in the Central Highlands, but I made more than 50 helicopter assaults. So what that would mean is the helicopters would come in like you see in the movies, and we would get out of them and engage the enemy where we were. And sometimes the firefights, they call them, would last a couple of hours, and sometimes it would last for days if the enemy positions were stronger. So I did that. And the other part for me that was interesting is most of the stuff that I'm telling you now, I had no recollection for 50 years because I had what they call post-traumatic stress. So I suffered from a thing called flashbacks. So I there were I think I want to say four, but there were really five incidents that flashed through my mind every single day for 50 years. Of these were horrific events that I was engaged in, battles that I was engaged in, seeing in one case seeing an American destroyed, that sort of stuff. So it blocked me from the rest of what happened in Vietnam because I never could think about it. I would get stuck in a flashback. And it wasn't until I retired that I was able to like they started coming back again really seriously. So my doctor told me to go to the veterans because they had figured out how to help soldiers with post-traumatic stress. So I went in 2014 and I'm still going now to address some of those problems.
Wow. So it's possible that something might happen to you today to set it off,
Yeah, it happens all the time. It still happens every day.
but you have it
Uh,
under control.
yeah, I would basically say I have it under control. I don't dwell on it. It's not as uh, problematic as it was before. Like when I got out, in order to address it, I was a workaholic. At my jobs, I worked. In fact, in one company, they had to change the payroll because I was working more than 100 hours a week.
Wow.
I was working on computers, so I just stayed working all the time so I wouldn't have to think about this stuff. And then when I stopped working, that's why it all kind of came back. So,
Interesting.
and people that are listening to this, if you know veterans out there that served in war, and not just veterans, but anybody that suffered from stress, post-traumatic stress, big car accidents or women that get abused or stuff like that, it's very difficult for them to address and to be present. And that was the big thing for me. And it takes, for me, I'm in groups, I'm in two veterans groups that were with combat soldiers similar to myself. And by listening and talking in those groups, I'm able to free up some of this stuff and, get a little bit of clarity on what happened to me.
Um, that the group therapy, I guess, is what you probably have to go through, or you go through, um, to talk these things out and get them out of your system. I would assume.
Well, that's part of it. But basically, what it is that we're more interested in how to live today. So we're not spending very much time about our war experiences. We're talking about the problems that it causes, like with our families, with our children, with our jobs, things like that. So we kind of coach each other on how to respond better than what we were doing before. So that's kind of how it works. It's not, dwelling on the horrific things that happened in war.
You hear a lot about PTSD these days when you have some of these people who are involved with mass shootings, and they blame that as one of the reasons why they get involved with these horrific situations.
Yeah, I don't know what would prompt for me. It was avoidance. Like I didn't never would be with any men. I'd stay away from them because I basically thought they were dangerous, especially in groups. So I lived, basically without uh, that kind of contact. So I went to the Patriots football game. I used to have season tickets, but it got so bad being in there with, thousands of people, men. It was I would just get so disturbed that I couldn't make it through the games. So I gave up my tickets and stopped going to big events where there were a lot of men, because you never knew what was going to happen. So at least that's the way I thought about it.
Yeah.
And I still have that as a stress point. Um, but I get on. I made a great career for myself. I've been married for more than 50 years. I've got, I had two children. My daughter just, her and her spouse just had a son 2 years ago. So now I have a grandson. So my life is similar to everybody else's, but most people don't remember or didn't know about people. I'm 74, 75 that were suffered in war. Well, we will probably be the last ones that, because of the draft, thousands, millions of men in America were drafted and served there. 50,000 of the guys died.
Some of the politicians want to start the draft all over again.
Yeah, I don't know what the point would be. I mean, there's no need for, big armies like that anymore. It would be helpful if they did something like public service, like you think of all the, natural disasters, the forest fires and the floods, to have a federal agency that could go in and provide support. For example, I do a lot of volunteer work, and I volunteered through the church when I got out. I'm a Catholic, so I use St. James, and I taught kids, and we would take them on what we call mission trips. We would go to, poorer areas in the country and help the people. And so people remember Hurricane Katrina. Well, the federal government didn't do anything to help out in Mississippi and the South where this happened. So church groups went down there, and our group went down for 2 years in a row. We spent a week down there, and the place was devastated. New Orleans, for almost 100 miles around it, everything was gone. One of the things we noticed, we got to Gulfport. That's where we were. A, a Walgreens, one of those big supermarkets, had washed into the ocean. The whole building, everything. The cash register was floating, and the kids did all the work. So we would help shingle roofs and take care of children, that sort of stuff. And we did that for a solid week, for 2 years in a row, and the government never showed up. It was all just religious people, not just from Massachusetts, but from all over the country to help out. And I kind of like that.
They still doing that now with the damage from the tornadoes and stuff?
You never hear about it. And I'm pretty sure the government doesn't do anything. I don't think they have the resources to help out. Or they don't, that's why I say, so if they did bring the draft in, have the, 18, 20-year-old young people take on an assignment like that for a year or two to help out, the country could certainly use it. But I don't know if they ever will.
Well, I'm sure if you have anything to do with it, you'll make sure that they do channel their efforts in that direction. I'm interested in some of the comments you made coming back to the United States. When you're in your classroom, you did bomb. What am I trying to think of? You did protect yourself under the desk type of situation.
Oh yes, that's what I went to St. Mary's School, which they knocked down the building, but it was an Immaculate Conception parish, which was right off of Canton Street and School Street. And when I was young, it was a 1 through 8 grades. So I went in there, but it was in the 50s, 1950s, in that era. And at the time, we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, not Russia, but it was the Soviet Union. And both countries had the atom bomb. And so what they did is they had drills, air raid drills in the classrooms for us. So what they would think is that that Russia, or not Russia, the Soviet Union was going to drop an atom bomb on Boston. So what would all the kids do in the classrooms? So what they trained us to do was to get on, we had an air raid drill, we would get under our desks, and little kids, I think I was in the third grade when this happened, we would put our hands together and put our eyes on our hands so we couldn't look up. And then the teachers would admonish us, don't look up, because if you did, there was a flash, I guess, when the bomb went off, that we would be blinded. And we would stay like that. And then they told us to pray that we would survive, and also to pray that if the communists came to our school, why they ever would, I have no idea, but that we would have the courage to admit that we were Christians, and because they were communists and they didn't believe in God. So they wanted us to pray that we would have the strength to do that, and maintain our Christianity in the face of the communist invader that would somehow come after children. So that was the way we lived like that. And then later, when I was 15, we had the trouble with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And again, Cuba was a country that was aligned with the Soviet Union. They wanted to put missiles on Cuba that could reach the United States with atom bombs. And Kennedy went against Khrushchev and stopped that from happening. But we thought it was likely to happen, that they were going to, eventually shoot an atom bomb, on a rocket from Cuba that could hit the United States. So when I was growing up, and I had a girlfriend, and she thought that, that's one of the reasons why I joined the service, because the communists were likely to do, not just in America, but wherever they could hurt people. And my job, that I thought, was to protect them and to keep freedom in the United States and anywhere else where people were, make that a possibility, that we could, countermand the communists from advancing through Southeast Asia and India and eventually around the world.
Yeah, but that was a kind of a scary time when the president was standing his ground,
right,
and telling the Soviets to get the rockets out of Cuba.
Right, take them away. And we boycotted what I think they did something with ships where they wouldn't let them land, and and
Right.
we've never had a good relationship with Cuba since.
There was they blockaded the area, turned the ships around.
Right, sent them back.
You think about some of the things that are going on these days, it sounds very similar.
Yeah,
Countries like North Korea, the things they're doing, and the plans that are going into effect to thwart whatever they try to do.
right, and you hope that we can keep up that pressure to North Korea. The South Koreans are our allies, and the rest of Asia, that sort of stuff, that we can still be a force in the world for freedom.
Yeah. I find it very interesting when you're talking about changes that were taking effect in the country, about plastic, about color TVs, transistor radios. I mean, things that most people that are alive these days don't even know about.
Never heard of them.
Yeah, telephones with dials on them. Yeah, I remember going through all that. The armory with the rock and roll dances.
Right.
That's some of the good stuff that happened at that point. You talk about the A&W root beer, and what else did you see?
Well, the A&W was right next to where McDonald's is in Stoughton now, only McDonald's was much smaller, and you could get a hamburger for 15 cents. So we would go to the A&W because you could get a mug of root beer for a nickel.
Right.
And then for the 15 cents would run over and get the hamburger and come back and have and they used to have, I don't know what's the right word, is it like car hop girls?
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't know if I'm supposed to say that today, but the young ladies, high school kids would come out to the car and bring the big root beers, and you'd put them on a little rack that was on, you'd roll down the window and you'd hang them there. And so, that with the boys would go and flirt with the car hops and, get our burgers. And that's where we sort of hung out, you know.
Similar. There's not too many of the E&Ws around anymore. I think there's one in Taunton.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen one for a long, long time.
Well, we have something similar going on in Stoughton with Sonic. They have
Oh, yes.
car hops on with skates.
Oh, they come out with on the skates to, service the people pulling in the cars.
Yep. Interesting. Times have changed, hopefully for the better. President Johnson escalated the draft you had in your notes
Mm-hmm.
for the Vietnamese War. A lot of resistance to signing up.
Yeah, a lot of people didn't want, and I didn't understand that. When I went into, take my oath of service, when I went into Boston Army Base, they had a lot of men that were drafted, and it was a near riot. It was just awful that there were so many men that just did not want to serve. And I thought, it was your duty as a citizen. I mean, who can argue with that? If the country calls you, like my father went, he was drafted, all those guys. I just thought it was an extension of, uh, being a citizen. But the country had started to change. They weren't that interested in, I don't know what the requirements of a citizen are today, but, would you serve your country? Would you, go to war for your country? What would you do? Or how do you live as a citizen? And so for me, it was that. And then when I got out, obviously, I volunteered, I clean parks, I do all of that stuff as a citizen to, help out my town.
Your father didn't want you to join up, did he?
No, he didn't, because he was in Germany during the Second World War, and he thought it would cost me more than I knew if I even lived.
Well, he's
But
just
what was it?
he was
What
trying
was
to
I going to do?
trying to protect you.
Yeah, no, that's what fathers do.
That's their job. That's correct. Um, you your situation is very similar to what you read about in the papers today with Russia, where they want to conscript more men to get on the front line in Ukraine, and a massive exodus of eligible men for 18 to 50 years old or whatever it was. They all left the country.
Yeah, to try to get away from it.
Right. Um, just trying to think. Your story is quite interesting. Um,
Well, one of the other things of back then that I find curious today is when I went to high school, boys in the fall would, come in their pickup trucks and their cars just like they did today, but they would carry rifles and shotguns in the cars and park in the school yard, because after school or before school they were out hunting. And so nobody ever thought about it. And the whole time I went to high school, I had a jackknife in my pocket. It just, can you imagine that today? That
no,
the people,
no,
nobody thought anything of it, right? It's just the way we lived. It was so different back then. And if you had an upset with somebody, you wouldn't shoot them. You might get into a fist fight with them, but there was, that would, you weren't going to stab anybody. So it's all changed now, and I don't know exactly what prompted that. But now, back then, people, had more, I guess, more control, or more parents would have something to say, or, schools would, or you're more respectful of the systems than they are today.
Right. No, I'm just curious also about the fact that you did a lot of back and forth in helicopters.
Hmm.
Weren't they shot at? I mean,
Yeah. So when we flew in them, a lot of times you'd sit on your helmet. Not that it would do you any good, but in case they were shooting up from the ground, or when we were coming in to an area where there were maybe five or six, or sometimes there could be as many as 30 helicopters all coming in loaded with guys to drop them off. Uh, that what would happen is, because I was a squad leader, I had my men, I would lean out. I used to carry a piece of rope that I could tie onto a little hook, a cargo hook inside the helicopter. And I could stand on the little skid and lean out and look to see where we were landing. And if I saw red smoke, because they used to throw smoke grenades, I knew that the LZ, the landing zone, was going to be hot. So I would tell my guys to lay down flat, and they would get on top of each other. And as we came in, they would roll off the helicopter, so they weren't sitting up. They would just flop onto the ground, because they never landed the things. They'd always just fly along. And that's how we, kept ourselves alive. Um, and we did this all the time. We got very, very good, working out of helicopters. And sometimes you'd have to come down on ropes, like you see in the movies. They'd drop down ropes because there was not an area big enough for a helicopter to land. It'd just be like a clearing in the jungle.
right.
Come down on a rope to get to the ground.
Interesting. Um, you at some point while you were over there, you would call in artillery strikes, airstrikes, and naval guns and stuff like that.
Hmm. Well, that's because I was smart. I was, they call me smart because I could add two and two together, but I could read a map and do the coordinates. So you could figure out left and right, and then I could give a map location to an artillery observer, and then they could set the big artillery pieces to lob the big ordnance there. And the same thing with the naval guns. The only thing with the naval guns, you had to do three, not two. So I don't know what people are going to make any sense of this, but if you look at a map, it's two dimensions. There's up and down, I mean, left and right. But when you were doing naval guns, because of the trajectory of it, you also had to give the altitude of where you were, because the rounds would fly so high. They had to have that third dimension to know how to drop it where it was supposed to go. And this stuff was horrific. I mean, you can't, people have no idea what it's like when one of those things go off. I mean, it's just awful. Uh, but we did it all the time. We had to. That was how we survived.
When you left Vietnam, was that when the war was over, or did it continue on from that point?
It still continued on. I left in 1969, and I think the war officially ended in 1974.
Yeah, I've
So,
seen some stories about Vietnam on CNN, I guess there was. I was watching. It seems to be it's cleaned up, and is it a place that you'd want to go back to?
no, I had no interest in going back to it all. And it was a terrible time in my life. I did things that I never could imagine that I would have had to do. And there was nothing about the country that had any appeal to me. So I had no interest in going back there. It would just probably bring back more stress than anything else.
Sometimes I would think that if you go back and see how things are, and you were involved in the destruction, but it's all looks like it's all been reconstructed. Maybe that would help you get rid of the PS.
Yeah, it might. I mean, I don't know. I know some men do go back and it's healing for them, but I think that's something you'd have to come up with on your own, and I'm just not interested. I'll take my nightmares versus going back to the place.
You flew home on a world plane. What was a world plane?
So that's what we call them. So all the guys who came home, what basically the distinction was when you're in Vietnam, you were in hell, and the world plane would taking you home. So they used to, and a lot of these were commercial planes that they, somehow would contract with people, and they would, fill the planes up with GIs. And the other thing is when you were over there, you only were serving for a year, actually 365 days. So when you landed in the country, you knew the day you were supposed to go home, a year later to that day. So these planes were constantly flying, taking people, dropping them off there. If they didn't go over on ships, they came in on planes, and then the plane would turn around and fly the same number of guys back because it was time for them to go home. And in my case, I served for 2 years because I uh, took an extended tour and I stayed over there because I knew what I was doing. I was a accomplished soldier and all that sort of stuff. So, and I wasn't that there was nothing really when I came home. Would have been, if I waited 6 months or a year to come home, it wouldn't have made that much difference. But it might save another few young men that had never been there before. Maybe like in my case, I'd be replacing one of those that they wouldn't have to go through what I had gone through. I was already there, knew how to do it. So I stayed. I enlisted or volunteered for another tour of duty over there.
The trip home was a little bit quicker than the trip there.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
Well, I can't imagine 22 days in a ship
Oh, it was awful. And it was
without air conditioning.
no air conditioning, and they slept us on these racks. They were bunks, maybe canvas bunks that were 6 high in the bays of the ship,
Six high.
6 high.
You
And
had
there
to
was
climb a
enough,
ladder to get up there.
and if you leaned on your side, rolled over, the
You fall.
guy you'd be stuck between the guy above you and the guy below you. It was just awful. And you can imagine what that with no showers.
Oh,
It was awful.
jump overboard.
Right. But it was a different time. People didn't have, the sensibilities that we have today. You were just different culture, I guess, maybe.
Interesting. I would assume that by looking at you, you're completely healed up from all the ailments that you were afflicted with.
Pretty much, I have one of the things because of being a paratrooper, I have arthritis in my knees. So these are things that the veterans agree that were caused by that. And I have hearing aids because of, I told you shooting the gun off over there. So I have
Yeah.
hearing aids, and I have, a couple of other medical issues, high blood pressure, that sort of stuff that the veterans are taking care of me now to make sure that I don't get any worse. Uh, so that's because they're much more service focused on us now. They're trying to take care of us, where before they used to avoid us. So, I mean, I still take advantage of that. And my stress is not as bad because I'm in those groups. So that's helping me out. So all in all, I feel much more at peace with myself and more integrated into the society or America, and particularly in my town of Stoughton. I do a lot of volunteer work to try to stay helpful and not dwell on, it could be worse, or rather than complain, do something. That's the way I address it. Just help out. There's plenty to do. Oh,
If people that are watching this show are interested in doing volunteer work, what do you recommend to them?
well, what I did is I volunteered for, I found things that I could do. Like, say, one of the things was the memorial uh, locations around the town for veterans. So Paul Sawanker's Park up by Page Street, I've taken care of that for 30 years. I plant flowers there. I put out the little, I, clean out, weed out the things. I do that, and I do that well, a couple of times in the summer, and then I put in the flowers in the spring, the summer, and the fall, and keep it clean. And I try to get some people to help me because I'm getting old now. I'm 75 years old. I don't know how much longer I can do this, but I'm hoping somebody will come along and pick that up. And then there's these little like corner signs to veterans that you see, I think, blue and black signs. So I take care of one of those from one of my classmates down on Drake Ave. I keep that and I put flowers in and clean that one out. So I look for things like that. And then on the town, I serve, right now I'm on two town boards. I serve on the Board of Assessors. I just took on that assignment, and I also serve on the Memorial Sign Committee that's made up mostly of veterans, where we authorize, you know, veterans who have died. They have to meet certain conditions, and we vote for them to have a sign or a square named after them. And I was on the zoning board for years, so there's plenty of things to do in Stoughton to volunteer. The town does that. Sometimes the selectmen will have committees that they want to get more information or want to get input in from the town citizens. So, you just have to keep your eyes and ears open and then volunteer, help out. Or if you're religion or if you're in a church, teach the kids, uh, clean the buildings. And then there's so much to do. And it's so expensive to pay to have a lot of this stuff done that, volunteerism really makes a big difference and is very appreciated.
One of your paragraphs has an interesting lead in. On the positive side, this country is worth the sacrifices you made. And you also consider your hometown special also. And that's quite evident by what you're talking about now.
Right. You have a place, like I come from Stoughton. I mean, that's very, very important to me. I grew up here. I watched the town change. I support the local restaurants. Anything I can do to make the town healthy, vibrant, I'll do. I march in the parade, a Memorial Day parade. Uh, I, clean the cemeteries.
Reaction when you're marching in the parade, I'm sure, is very different than when you came home from Vietnam.
Right. I'm the only one that marches. No other veterans march, just me.
You're kidding.
And it's been like that for years. Now, a couple of the VFW will have a couple of guys carrying the flags, but I'm the only actual soldier marching. And it's been like that for a very long time. Because the guys are old. A lot of them can't walk, the route, a couple of miles, but I still struggle with it, but I'm going to keep doing it until I can't anymore.
You're a good guy, Mark.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure. I've enjoyed this conversation with you, and anything I can do to assist you somehow, I'd be happy to do it. You're more than welcome to come back on Community Forum at your convenience. You name the subject, and I'll be happy to have you on.
But the other thing, Roy, is, I have all those notes, and I also have some other individual stories about Vietnam. So if any of your listeners want to get that material, if they can contact you then I can have them printed up and mailed to them if they want to read about it, or if there's, some of their family members were in Vietnam or were in, different things like that. I can get that information to them.
All right.
Just to kind of keep it going a little bit so people can say, oh yeah, this is how it was, and this is how that slice of life, at that time.
Yeah. All right, Mark, I thank you very much. Give my best to your wife. And thank you very much for coming on the show. And look forward to seeing you in picking up where we left off.
All right. Thanks, Roy. And
All right.
Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Have a
All right. Good night.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye now.